All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jonathon Ferguson. As Katie mentioned, I work at University of Wisconsin-Madison's Division of Extension and the Financial Security Program as a financial capability specialist, which means I have the opportunity to support and work with our financial coaches and educators across the state of Wisconsin, help build curriculum that's taught in various classes, and hopefully, at times, have the opportunity to speak directly with the residents of the state as well. So I'm very thankful for you all joining today to talk about this topic. Inflation is something that we've had to deal with more recently since 2019, 2020. And it's a good time now, I think, to kind of take stock of where things are and to explore possibilities for managing this thing called inflation that we all have to deal with. So I look forward to your questions. My main goal today is to address the concerns that you may have, or thoughts or comments or questions that you have. And of course, I have some prepared comments and prepared slides to facilitate that process. Um, so let's go ahead and get started. So today's focus is on inflation, like I said. However, we're going to focus on some specific areas that inflation impacts folks, and those areas are housing, food, utilities, and transportation, because those are huge parts of people's budgets. And throughout the presentation, you'll have the opportunity. I know folks received some information ahead of time, but I'll just place in the chat here um, a link that should take you to a Google Doc that you can make a copy of or download to take some notes as we move throughout the presentation. So it's the same thing that you would have received ahead of time, but if for some reason that didn't happen or you're unable to find that email with that information, you should be able to click that link and that will take you exactly where you need to be. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do was kind of define what inflation is, because there are lots of different thoughts sometimes about what inflation means and what it is. So I wanted to level set. So we have a common understanding of how I am defining it and how it is generally defined before we move through the presentation. So inflation is an increase in the average price level of goods. So it's not necessarily just one thing. So right now in the news, I think the biggest thing that's talked about with inflation right now are eggs. I did shopping this past week at the grocery store, and eggs were close to twice the price I normally pay for eggs. And that has to do with inflation, but also some other things that are not necessarily inflation based, that they're based on the sourcing of those eggs. So that's why that's incredibly high. So it's not just eggs, it's not just gas, it's a number of different things. And it's a measure of the price level um, in those goods, that basket of goods. And it's an increase in that. So the inflation rate that the government really wants is about 2%, because that's an indication that the economy is growing. So in some ways, it's ideal to have inflation as long as it's under control, right? So not long bouts of high inflation, but instead extended time frames with measured, controlled low inflation, and 2% is the goal for that. The opposite of inflation is deflation, which is what a lot of folks are wanting because of this recent inflation that we've had. However, the challenge with deflation is it's an indicator of a shrinking economy. And when the economy shrinks, that often means there are some other things going on that are not necessarily positive. So higher unemployment, lower wages, things of that sort. And so while we all want prices to decrease, we don't really want deflation for any extended period of time because then that brings about a different set of challenges that oftentimes, if you look throughout history, can be um, just as tough or even tougher to deal with than inflation. So we just have to find a balance. And the balance that we're hoping for is 2%. So that's what inflation is. That's how we'll define it. And when we talk about it today, that's what we'll be considering. Okay, so with inflation, the most important thing is your purchasing power declines. So if you had a dollar, I'll use my example. When I was a kid, I can do this now, which makes me feel older in age. But I can say, like, when I was a kid, I would go to the store and I could get a bag of candy or a candy bar or a drink for this price or that price. And it was true, right? If I had a dollar and I went to the store and I wanted to buy some goodies for myself, I could buy a whole lot more with a dollar when I was a kid than I can now. And that's natural because, again, inflation we want to happen at a measured pace. But that does mean the purchasing power of that dollar is decreased. So over time, we're going to expect that, but it's also going to impact some communities more than other communities. So it generally impacts low income individuals more because a higher percentage of the money they have is held in cash. So they either have it like with themselves or they have it in a checking account. Um, or they have it maybe in a savings account, but those are all things that typically yield very little interest there, you know, generally. And to keep up with the pace of inflation, usually you want your money to grow with it. You want that dollar to maintain its purchasing power. And the only way to do that is by either earning more dollars, right? So you negate the impact of inflation, or placing that dollar in some type of investment that grows at the level of inflation or above it. So people on fixed incomes who cannot earn more dollars because their incomes are fixed, and don't necessarily put their money in investments that are long-term growth type things are going to be the folks that are hit hardest. So people on low incomes and people with fixed incomes. And so to give an example of this, in March 2020, if you had $100, right, you would need a different amount of money today to have that same purchasing power. And so just a little while ago, I checked that out, and you would need about 100, somewhere in the neighborhood of 120, $23 today to have the same purchasing power that $100 had in March 2020. Right. So it's been really tough to deal with because inflation's been really high in these last few years. Okay, so as I mentioned, purchasing power is going to decline. Inflation erodes that. Um, Damage to the economy is going to happen with persistent inflation, and though short-term inflation is typical, the government is going to want that 2% inflation target, which we have been above for a number of years now. And borrowers pay back dollars that are worth less than agreed upon. So if you borrowed, like I bought a house in 2019, and so those dollars that I'm paying back now are worth less than agreed upon because they was worth a certain amount in 2019. They're worth less now, so that benefits me. Um, but again, to be in a position where you're buying a house, borrowing something, that usually means you have some financial advantages, and a lot of folks don't have those financial advantages. So it is a serious thing that we have to consider. Okay, so now we're going to have a little bit of interaction and engagement. So on the screen, you'll see a graphic with a number of different categories for spending. So you got apparel, you got housing, you got transportation. So I want you all to take a look at those. And if possible, all right, I want you all to rank them. And then I want you to post your top three categories in the chat. And when I say rank, I mean of importance to you, things that you believe of those categories are most important. So number one, all the way on down by importance. So go ahead and take a look at that. And then when you're ready, post your top three in the chat if so interested. So I'll give you all a few seconds to do that. Now, keep an eye on the chat to see what we have coming in. All right, so we've got housing, food and beverage, and medical care, housing, food, and communication, housing, medical, and food, medical, housing, and food and beverages, medical care, transportation, housing, food and beverages, medical care, housing, food, transportation, food. So we're noticing some trends here probably, right? And the things that are most important to folks. Medicine, medical care, food, communication, food and beverage, medical care, housing, housing, transportation, housing, food, and medical. Thank you all for participating in this. This is really cool to see some of these trends come through. So um, that's important because when you see the inflation number and things like this in the news, that's based on a certain measure. And so this is what that looks like. So when you look at how inflation is measured, the Consumer Price Index or CPI, which is what you all will see in the news, it's made up of a certain um, formula, I guess. And so the things that impact inflation the most, if you just look at the numbers there on the side, the measured inflation are going to be food and beverage, housing, and transportation, and then followed by medical care. So if I looked at all of the, which I did, and I hope I didn't miss anyone as I read through those, all the things that are most important to people are the things that impact inflation the most. So when you see inflation's high, usually it's those categories that are high that are most important. Um, so food, housing, transportation, and medical, if I just do quick math here, if I add those up, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 83, 84% of what inflation is measured by. So if you feel like, hey, this has been really challenging for me because inflation's high, like this confirms that those areas have been hit the hardest because they make up the biggest pieces of inflation. So um, that's important to know. All right. So the other side of this is unemployment statistics, because a lot of times people will say like, well, if you're employed, you get raises every year at your job. Well, one, that doesn't apply to people who are on fixed income who are maybe retired. They don't necessarily have the opportunity to get a raise every year, depending on what their situation is. So that's one thing. But even though that's the case, if someone is working and earning more money on a yearly basis, um, that's good, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's combating inflation in the most important areas for them. So our unemployment rate is generally actually pretty low, and you can even look. I put uh, in the handout in the notes a link there. There's a link there where you can find the unemployment rate in your county. So if you're interested in that, you can take a look at that. Um, but even though unemployment is low, that's not necessarily combating inflation the way we would want, and that's because of this. So this chart will show you that inflation and wages have not been in sync. right? So for a number of years there, inflation was higher than wage increase for anyone who was working. And just over the last few years, that started to flip, but not so much that people feel like their wages are accounting for the inflated prices that they're finding in the grocery stores and otherwise. And on the right side of the screen, you'll see some what I think are some pretty hard-hitting numbers about inflation. Right. So between 20, so those 5 years, 2020 to 2024, food costs increased by over 28%. That's a lot, right? Transportation, 29%. Housing costs, 25%. And even if you own your home and you're not renting, so your rent's not going up, and if you own your home outright or if you have a mortgage, those prices should be locked in. But as you all likely know, if you're in that situation, your property taxes have probably risen, and then also your insurance premiums have risen dramatically. All right, so it's even impacted folks in those situations. So it's been a rough haul these last 5 years. When you look at these numbers, they're pretty sobering and they're pretty high. But that's really where we are there. Now, sometimes people will ask me, well, what should I be spending on different things? What's a reasonable amount for me to spend on food or on what have you? Well, one, you determine that, right, based on your budget and what you feel is most important to you. If you're looking for a general guide, this link that I'll put in the chat is something called the Family Budget Calculator. And you can use that to get a general idea about what an average person to live an average life would spend in your specific area. Now, it doesn't have every single town, I don't think, in there, but it does a pretty good job of narrowing things down to um, region in the state, or even county in the state, or city in the state. But I can't guarantee that every single town's on there, but it does a pretty good job. So if that's something that you're interested in learning about and thinking about, well, how do I measure up to what's considered average about what I'm spending? Or if I want some guidance on what I spend in different categories, that's one way to explore that topic. And I could spend a lot of time on that tool, but I won't today because I want to get to some other stuff. All right. So now some time just for some open chats, open discussion, if you all would like. So what, if anything, surprises you about the statistics we just went over? What resonates with your experience with inflation? And then what questions or comments do you have? And so I'll invite you all to post things in the chat in response to any of those questions, or come off mute if that's the case and you have something to add. I want to make sure that I'm addressing your questions and the things you want to know. So I wanted to take a little bit of a break from the prepared comments to give you all the opportunity to share some thoughts on any of those questions. So I'll pause here, give you all some time to think, and see what questions or comments you may have related to those discussion prompts on the screen.
There's one thing in our society that has always troubled me regarding always wanting the growth. We always, every Christmas, they tell us, oh, we only spent this percentage more than last year. And it's like a never ending vicious cycle where we always have to be spending more. And it promotes a lot of consumerism, really, where we're just spending to spend rather than taking need into consideration. And I
Mm,
know that that is certainly promoted by people who are selling goods, but I've never thought it was a wise thing to always be wanting the public to be spending more, or else we're not doing well. And I wonder if there's any thought of changing that attitude in our society, or
mhm.
anything to think about that differently. Maybe I'm missing something, but it's always troubled me that the message is always to spend more, buy new. And as a result, a lot of the things that are being produced are of lower quality and they don't last. And so you do
Yeah.
have to buy more often.
Yeah, it's a good point. One of the um, great things about our culture is the freedom we have to enjoy various products and consumption. Um, but it's in the eye of the beholder if that's been overdone. Because, most of our economy is consumption, meaning things that we're just buying for enjoyment. If I had to put a shorthand to that. And there are benefits and challenges to it. And you outlined some challenges that we've experienced for sure. So I appreciate the comment. I see a couple in the chat. And so on the last chart, wages were higher than inflation over the past few years. Isn't that what we want? Absolutely. That is absolutely what we want. And it's good that we're heading in the right direction for sure. Um, One of the things that we have to so averages are great, but averages are not necessarily the best depiction of what uh, the entire population is feeling. So, for example, you can have folks in a certain industry who have wages that go up tremendously and folks in others that don't. And then that'll throw the averages off a little bit. And so that's something that if we had more time, we'd likely investigate and talk about more today, because that's how sometimes we have folks who are experiencing different things. Like some folks will say, "Oh, inflation, I don't really see it. I'm feeling pretty good." And then someone else who's saying the exact opposite is because their personal experiences are different. And so we're headed in the right direction, but we also want to make sure that we're taking note of the various populations and what their experiences are. A couple other things, yeah, increased a lot since 2020. Real estate is a solid investment, or at least it has been over the last 5 years, more so than what it typically is. Real estate is often a really strong investment, but the last 5 years, for a variety of macroeconomic reasons, it's been an even better investment than it has been historically. So that's a good point. Let's see, been impacted by fixed income and cost of living has gone up for sure, and insurance rates have soared. Absolutely. And in lots of different insurance categories, and just about all of them, they've soared for sure. And while we're not focused on insurance today because that impacts a number of people very differently, it is something that's core to many people's experience. And so insurance is very, very important, and that's also gone up. So it's been a tough 5 years. Let's see. And one more comment: is it an insult to workers that federal hourly wages is still $7.25, and Wisconsin goes by that guideline? I don't know if I can say it's an insult because I don't know, that would be a comment that would come with judgment for me, so I'm going to stay away from that. I'll say that it's a lower number than it is in many states. I can't say most because I don't know that for a fact. And in many states, and it hasn't shifted for a number of years, while cost of living has gone up tremendously. Um, During that same time frame. So making $7.25 15 years ago meant something than it does today. And the minimum wage number has not shifted in that way. So I think those are just factual statements, not necessarily um, pushing any specific agenda, but that's something that we have to consider for sure as we think about how we move forward as a society. But yeah, it's a good point, because those who are lower income and on a fixed income are going to be hit hardest by this. All right, thanks for the engagement there. I appreciate it. Okay, so then the question comes. All right, we talked about a lot of challenging stuff. I don't want to bring everyone down because because none of that was particularly like woohoo. Yes, we're headed in a great place. Although there were a few things there, including wages going up and things like that. But there are things that you can do to, I guess, fight inflation. And specifically in these categories: food, transportation, housing, and utilities. And I picked those because those are the core ones that impact most people at at the most amount of the time. Obviously, there are other categories that are super important. Medical care and insurance are a couple, but these are things that, generally speaking, if you're an adult, regardless of age, you need in some way to live the life that you want to live, right? So they're pretty widespread across the population. All right. So the first thing you can do, I think, is use available benefit programs. So there are programs available to the public, from community resources that can be the government or nonprofits, so on and so forth, to support the population who is struggling with this inflation and don't have as many tools in their toolbox to combat it as those who are maybe earlier in their careers and seeking a growth trajectory in their salary. And so I would encourage you all to do that. And so I've got some resources on the screen that you all may want to consider if you're not already considering. And then there's an opportunity to explore those certainly after our presentation. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on those now because, frankly, I'm not the best person to investigate each individual situation to know what's best for them in this format. But there is an opportunity for you to explore that after the presentation. But that's the number one thing I want people to do because those programs are there for specific reasons to benefit the people who can benefit from them. So please do take advantage of them. All right, so let's talk about food, my favorite thing. One of my favorite things. So, what can you do to fight inflation on food? So, there are some general tips that I'm going to suggest everyone do. And you probably heard some of these before, but the reason you've heard them before is because they work and they're important, right? So, we're going to hit some of those again. So, one, plan meals ahead, right? I know sometimes that's annoying to some folks because they're not necessarily planners, quote unquote. They don't identify that way, but there are benefits from doing so that will spread across um, your budget and provide just a little bit more order to your your household finances. So, generally speaking, I think it's ideal to plan for the next week. And if you do that, it's going to encourage you to buy necessary items, things that you know you need to have, as opposed to getting into the store and seeing what's attractive on the end cap. Like for me, I mentioned this yesterday during a separate session. If I go into a store and there are Doritos on the end cap, I am buying them. Period. Like I just have a hard time avoiding it. I love Doritos, the blue bag or the red bag. Doesn't really matter. The answer is yes. Um, but when I plan ahead of time, I know that that's outside of the scope of what I'm looking for. So it minimizes the number of bags of Doritos that I'm going to buy. I'm probably still going to buy them, provided the price isn't ridiculous, because they're usually on sale if they're on an end cap. But it kind of puts that in my mind that this is not on my list. I don't need to do this, or I'm going to minimize the number of things I do with this. So planning ahead is critical. If you can't do that, at least take a few minutes before you go into the store to think about what are the main things that I need to have from this trip to the grocery store. All right. Check cupboards. I have a partner who's very guilty of this. So we'll go to the store and we'll buy items and we'll come back home and realize like, oh, we already have two of those items. We don't need a third one right now. Right? We could have saved that money and put that towards something else. So it seems like an obvious thing, but it does take time. It takes intention to check the items that are in your cupboard. Um, and when you do that, it's going to help you organize your shopping a lot better and keep more money in your pocket for that specific week, even if you buy a third item of something you already have two of that you will eventually use. Because an argument can be made like, well, yes, we have a third can of chickpeas, but so what? We always eat chickpeas. But we didn't eat that third can this week. And if we're on a tight budget and we're kind of living more paycheck to paycheck, we could have done something else with that 89 cents than having that third item of chickpeas. All right, this is a huge one. Please do consider store brand items. So obviously there are brands that you see commercials for and you see lots of marketing for. I won't name any specifically, that are not made by the store company, but they're made by a separate private company. And those are the ones that are going to have the most marketing, so on and so forth. But with many of those items, those categories of food items, you can get something very similar made by the store, that company that you're shopping at. And those costs can be as much as 25% cheaper than the name brand items or the brand name items, depending on how you say that. So that's a small thing, but we've been doing that, at least in my household, for a number of years, and we've saved a lot of money on a week by week basis. And then, of course, overall, considering store brand items before we consider brand name items. Sometimes people are like, "Oh, the tastes are very different. I don't like this." Um, so, if that's true, what I encourage people to do is to look at the back of the items, the ingredient list, and see where the differences are. If the ingredients are exactly the same, then I suppose it's possible it could taste different, or it's possible that the marketing has influenced us that it tastes different as well. Marketing is very powerful, right? So that's something that you want to consider also. Of course, shop the sales. So each store will have a weekly ad. It's important to look through those and determine if there's something that's already on your list that you can get at a cheaper price that you just need to pay attention to it. Or even if you're open to what you want to eat that week and you want the weekly ad to guide some of the things that you might buy, you can use it either way, but it's good to know that ahead of time. Um, all right, so match the shopping schedule. All right, so when sales come, when they start, oftentimes is when a lot of people are there to buy those items. I've experienced this a few times. So the stores that I shop at, Pick and Save or Metro Market, those usually start midweek, I think Wednesday. Aldi, I think, starts at Wednesday on Wednesdays. Woodman's, I think it's Thursday. I don't shop at Woodman's because it's just too much of an experience for me. I know there are people out there that love Woodman's, but it's too big for me. So I don't do Woodman's, but there are lots of people that do. But wherever you shop, think about the time you shop, because if you want to buy items that are on sale, you're likely gonna have the greatest opportunity to do that at the start of a sale. Not that those items won't be there, but at the start of a sale. And this is even, if you can't do that and you shop on certain days of the week, are there times of day that you can go that you think you'll be more able to get the sale? So as an example, I shop at Aldi. If I like had to shop on a Saturday because that's what's available in my schedule, then I've noticed over time, if I get there right away when it opens, items that are very popular because they're on sale or whatnot will be there. But once those items sell out, if I go at a certain time later in the day, that spot on the shelves will be empty. But if I go a little bit later, they'll be there because I've shopped there so often. I understand what their restocking time frame is. So at my Aldi, if I go on a Saturday between noon and 2, the most popular items are going to be gone. But for whatever reason, after 2 o'clock, they've restocked the shelves and those items are there. That's just how it works at my Aldi, right? And so you want to pay attention to those things as well if you're shopping for specific items that are on sale. Uh, Here, I'm of course going to promote veggies because veggies are important for health. Um, And so please do, here, I'll put this in the chat. I think that's the correct link that'll take you there. Hopefully it is. Buy things that are in season. And so if you go to USDA, that'll give you the seasonal snapshot. And then you can structure if you're looking for veggies. Like maybe I want to look at these veggies in particular during this season because they're going to cost less because they're in season as opposed to those that are out of season. So give that some thought. All right. Consider frozen or canned items can also be a good way to go. It depends on the person if this is a good fit and what their living situation is. But the last thing you want is for things that you buy at the store to spoil. If there's one big spending leak in America's food budget, it's buying food that's ultimately not eaten, right? So if you look at the data, we throw out a lot of food. So some folks will tell you we throw out, depending on the data, somewhere between 20 and 35% of the food we buy. All right. And if you do that, that means you've spent money on food that you never used. It didn't provide you any true nutritional value, and maybe you could have put that in other budget, at another place in your budget. So making sure that your food doesn't spoil and is available to you is important. And one way you can do that is by looking at frozen or canned items when it makes sense for your specific situation. All right. This is important. I could have started with this, but I think it's important to put it in here. Build a food budget. All right. So when you go to the store, make sure you have a guide for what you want to spend because food at the store can actually get out of control pretty quickly because we see a lot of things that we want. Um, Marketing, even in stores, is 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 a huge thing. And so you want to make sure that you're aware of what you want to spend when you go into the store. And some people even take that to the next level and they have a number in mind about what they want to spend or the items they want to buy. And they will actually keep track of that as they move throughout the store. So they'll have like a little clicker or they'll have a piece of paper and they'll jot down like a counter, like, yep, this is how much that costs, this is how much that costs as they go. So they're hyper aware of it while they're in the store. Of course, that might be not a good fit for you. Whatever is a good fit, I encourage you to check out and see what works for you. But you definitely want to keep a food budget and determine the things you want to buy. And here, look, even the things that I love, Doritos. Um, if I shop while I'm hungry, I'm likely to buy those 3 bags of Doritos because I can't imagine a world in which I won't eat them. It's a simple thing, but try not to shop while you're hungry. It's just not the best time to shop because it's going to influence your thinking um, and maybe even the things that you want. And it often leads to buying things that don't necessarily have real nutritional value. So you eat them and then an hour later you're hungry again, that kind of thing. So um, definitely try and do that. So those are the food tips. Now let's move on to other things that don't have nearly as many tips, but are important nonetheless. So transportation. Here are some things you can do for transportation. Um, So use technology to your advantage. Use apps that can help you find the lowest gas costs. Now, I will say you have to be careful with this. I have several people in my life who look for the lowest gas costs, and they're so into the lowest gas costs, they'll drive out of their way to get to the lowest gas costs and spend gas doing that. That doesn't measure up, that doesn't balance with getting that lower gas cost, right? So you can take anything to the extreme, but as it makes sense, look for the lowest gas costs. Keep recommended air levels in tires. If you're washing your car, try and do so at home. With insurance going up, one of the reasons why people have been so impacted by that negatively is that they don't shop their insurance. So you may have had the same insurance carrier for a number of years and it's just very comfortable. You like your insurance agent, for example, and that's great. But it's also helpful to know where could I get an equivalent level of coverage and service, and what does it cost for that equivalent level of coverage and service? Would it be cheaper elsewhere? That's a critical thing to think about um, each year, I think, with your insurance coverages. And then you've got a couple other things there that depends on your situation. Can you carpool? Can you bike or walk? Can you use public transportation? I see the question in the chat. Should we be stockpiling on food at this time? That's going to depend on your specific situation and what you think is coming in the future. Um, it's hard to know. So I think what you will want to do is to do the things that we already talked about, like having a food budget, um, planning out what you want to eat, so on and so forth. And then if you want to buy items that you know you're going to use in the future because you feel that those items are going to increase in price, which a lot of people do for various reasons I won't get into right now, but it has to do with what's going on within our government. um, then sure, you can do that. But you also have to be aware of like, well, if I do that, is some of this food going to be wasted? Right. So what kinds of things should I buy to ensure that they will be used and I actually can afford it in my budget? Right. So I wouldn't blow my food budget in such a way that it impacts my ability to cover other things that I need to pay for moving forward. But it's a worthwhile question and a good one, and I think each individual will need to determine if that's a good fit for them. All right, so that's transportation, housing. This one is a tricky one, right? So it depends on your situation. So if you're a renter, the best thing you can do, I think, um, is being a strong tenant, right? So um, you are following all the rules. You're paying your rent on time. You're doing other things that supports your residential community, and holding up your end of the bargain as it relates to being a renter. Hopefully, what that can do is when there's time for lease renewal, so on and so forth, you may have more opportunities to negotiate your lease renewal. If they're saying, hey, prices are going to go up by a certain amount, you may be able to say, well, I've been a renter here for a long time. I've been a strong tenant. Is there any way um, that maybe I could have a different price because of my intention is to stay here for a long time and continue being a strong tenant? So that's an example. But being a strong tenant um, is a great step. You can explore other housing options before you renew your lease. Consider starting your lease between December and March, if at all possible, because there's just more opportunity there for better prices because there are not as many people moving at those times for obvious reasons. Very much related to the conversation we were having before this session about -10 and 0-degree weather. Who wants to move in those? Consider this is something that sometimes people have done. I've got a few people in my life who've done it who have worked part-time for the rental agency. They have a part-time office job available or something like that, and they get a discount on their rent as a result. So that's something that people have done. As I just said about insurance, you can shop your rental and home insurance each year. And then you can also appeal your real estate property tax assessment if you think that it's out of bounds with what the true value of your home is. So that does not have to be something that you just take and say like, well, I guess that's what it is, even though I don't agree with it. And I think it's way too high based on what the real value of my home is. Now, I'll drop this in the chat for anyone who may be a homeowner and considering that. I think that'll take you to a page where it'll give you some information to file an objection to a real estate property assessment. That's something that you can consider as well. Of course, there's no guarantee that that's going to come out in your favor, but it's an important thing to consider. All right, and then utilities. So there are a couple of things you can do. So you can check with your provider on off-peak times that to use core appliances. So for example, it may cost more to run your dishwasher between the hours of 6 and 8 p.m. than it does if you do it overnight. So that's something that you'll want to consider. So what you'll see on the screen is a chart that shows like the peak hours for using major appliances. Just an example, and then how that decreases, those costs decrease by time of day. You can also program your thermostat. You can let dishes air dry, and there's data that shows you can save up to $40 annually doing that. And if you do the math, you're like $40 annually. That's, what, $3.50 a month. That doesn't mean anything to me. That's up to you. If it doesn't matter to you and you're not in a rush to have your dishes dry, might be better for you to have those $3.50 than paying that in a bill, right? So usually with inflation, it's a bunch of little things that can help, um, and maybe a few major things that can help. So every little bit counts. And then using cold water when washing clothes. Okay, so there's a question there in the chat. It's a good one. The appeal process for real estate seems overwhelming. Are there any programs that help with the process? I think that's going to be, I can't think of a cost-free program that's widespread that helps with that process. A lot of it's going to depend on resources available in your local level, and truly how complicated they make that to be. But I can't think of a cost free. There are, of course, lawyers and things like that that you can pay for that. Um, but I can't think of a cost free way. What I recommend with anything like that is to use your local library. They have books. There's a book on everything. And I bet there's a book that has, or several books that have great information on how to successfully appeal a real estate property assessment. So that's where I would start if there's nothing in my local level of a person that I can go to and talk about that. But I'll look into that to see if I've missed anything, but I don't think so. Nothing that I'm aware of at this moment is widespread. It's a good question. Other things to do to manage your utility cost. Adjust power management on computers, turn off lights when not needed. An easy one is to use the best fit burner for pots and pans when cooking. I have a stove that has different sizes, and for whatever reason, I unknowingly have like a favorite burner. I don't know if everyone does, but there's like a burner I go to every time inherently when I cook. Why do I do that? Even it doesn't matter how big the pot is or the pan is, but I do it every time, right? So making sure that you right size that and use the burner that is the best fit can help lower things. So it's a lot of little things you can do, not necessarily one huge thing. Okay, other things you can do, steps to cope with the impacts of inflation, budgeting, always going to help. Prioritizing your expenses, subscription services, um, have gotten out of hand for a lot of folks, because they're easy. You sign up for them once and then you just have a recurring charge on your whatever it may be. So you want to make sure you watch that, for sure. And then use 211 for other resources that may be available in your local community. You definitely want to be adaptable. Prioritize the bills that are critical for you. 100%, and then use some of these tips on the screens as well. So buying in bulk is something that people do, and that was mentioned earlier. You determine what bulk means, right? That could be buying in bulk for a small period of time that's going to cover maybe the next month. Some people are like, I'm going to buy in bulk for something for the next 6 months. Of course, you have to have a place to store all these things, and you have to do it in such a way where these things are not going to spoil or you're not going to use them. But that's a big one. Eating at home and packing lunches, and then, of course, looking for discounts on things that you regularly spend on. Uh, this may not be important for everyone in the audience, but it is, I think, a critical thing. Just be careful about your borrowing. Specifically from family and friends. I think folks have heard about the credit cards and understand how challenging those can be, but even borrowing from family and friends can lead to challenges with relationships. So considering that and looking at what your alternatives are, and thinking about bringing a financial supporter in your life. That could be a family or friend. And what I mean by financial supporter is just someone you can talk open and honestly with about the things that you're struggling with financially in terms of decision making, or if you do have to borrow money, to explore options. And of course, we have resources available at Extension that you might want to use for that too. All right, money traps to avoid. These things are very challenging to find long-term money success if you're using them. So payday loans in particular, um, rent to own stores. I always think of, like, I have a brother who does things very differently than me, which makes sense. We're not the same person. Um, but he, I remember years ago, got into renting a video game system. He was in his 20s at this point, that he was paying $40 a week for, actually $50 a week for, and the system itself cost $300. So had he saved that money for 6 weeks, he would have just been able to go and buy the system. Instead, after 6 weeks, he had nothing to show for it other than returning it to the store, and eventually he bought the system anyway, right? So it's making sure that you're thinking long term, about what your goals are. Building an emergency fund, this can be a challenge. But if something unexpected happens, or I'd say unplanned, that's the word I use because it's almost to me expected that something unexpected is going to happen. It's more like an unplanned expense. You don't know when that's going to occur. It's very important, if at all possible, to work your way towards building an emergency fund. Um, and there are several different ways to do that. You'll see some things on the screen, because every little bit counts. What matters is that you're headed in the right direction, even if it's $5 that you're saving. If you do that long enough, it's going to add up and really support you through something that might be challenging. Very important to have an emergency fund that you manage and an account you have access to, um, if your financial situation allows you to do that. And then, last but certainly not least, we just have time for questions and reflections. So I'll just open it up. Anything that I didn't talk about that you all want to, or Katie, maybe you have something that you want me to hit on that I didn't mention as well. So this is just open time for folks to add things in the chat, share more about what they want to know about, or if there are resources that they're looking for that I didn't cover. Again, it's always my goal to make sure that you all get as much out of this session as possible. So I'll just be quiet for a minute and see if y'all have anything. So feel free to drop something in the chat or unmute.
I guess one thing that you maybe skirted around but didn't say directly on food buying is maybe to stock up when items are on sale. You mentioned your garbanzo beans, and if they're only 89 cents, that's a good time to buy several cans if you use them frequently. And that has helped me a lot through the years to buy my frequently used items when they're on sale.
Yep, absolutely. As long as you will use them eventually. And those are things that are often going to be canned and frozen kind of things that you can buy in bulk that way, but that's a great way to do it. So that's great. I'm glad that's worked for you. So it sounds like it's a good tip, and you should keep it up, and hopefully others will too. Good. Any good information regarding insurance comparison? Not easy to read through information. Yeah, insurance is I don't know. Am I going to sound pessimistic? Insurance sometimes might be intentionally confusing. um, and it serves the benefit of the insurance industry. One of the things that well, there are lots of various things online that you can do to understand basic terms in insurance. There are also some good books that you can get from the library for that, but those are not going, they're going to give you more education that you can apply when you're reading. They're obviously not going to read things over for you. Um, a tool you could use, and I've done this for other things, not insurance, because I'm a nerd and I understand the stuff that's in it. Um, Using artificial intelligence to your benefit is something that you may want to consider, right? So there are lots of AI things where you can plug in information and say, translate this to me in plain language. And it will take what's the text that you have and then give you a different version of that in a way that maybe is more easy to understand. So that's another tool that you can use. But otherwise, I'd say try and use things that you find online that are informational pieces. Our state commissioner of insurance has insurance buying guides that can help as well. So if you just go to your internet, Wisconsin State Commissioner of Insurance buying guide, you likely will find various things there that can help you understand some of the very complicated language that you'll see in insurance things. Um, but yeah, that's where I would start. It's a good question.
While others are coming up with questions they might have, I'm gonna put the poll up for the evaluation. If you could just fill this out before you leave, that would be awesome. We would really appreciate it.
Thanks, Katie. And there's a few other things. Check different places to buy prescription drugs. Yep. And thanks, Mary Lou. That's also great. Yep. Stay positive, help others, and reach out when you need help. Yep. Using your community and having a strong community is one of the best things you can do to find your way through any tough time, even financial tough times. So absolutely.